It felt right, it felt genuine. And I felt very safe with him at that point. He felt like a very committed person. And he was single, as far as I knew at that point. And it seemed like we just kind of met each other at the right time.
The man who shared every aspect of Andrea's life for 2 years was in fact an undercover officer working for a secret unit inside the Metropolitan Police. Their entire relationship was a state-sanctioned lie.
That chunk of your life, of my life, was completely fabricated. So I spent quite a large portion of my time with someone who didn't actually exist at all.
This is the man who infiltrated Andrea's life, Carlo Neri. He had a passport and a driver's license in that name. For several months before they started seeing each other in late 2002, he was mixing in her circle of politically active friends. We agreed to protect her identity, such is the sensitivity of her story, but this is her real voice.
He was a hugely helpful person. He really made himself very useful within that group. He was very practical. He drove a car. Lots of people in London at that time, of that age, we were all kind of in our 20s, early 30s. We didn't have cars.
But why target Andrea, not her real name? She wasn't that politically active, but some of her friends were. For Carlo Neri, it was a way in.
I've got no idea why I was chosen, other than to think that I was probably just quite a safe bet to become respectable in those circles of trade unionists and socialists. They had quite strong views politically, and so did he.
Andrea's story raises huge questions about the ethics of undercover policing. The scale of deception is shocking. And for what? Andrea has no criminal record, and she was simply on the margins of a group of left-wing political activists, mostly linked to the Socialist Party. Andrea met Carlo Neri in September 2002 on this demonstration in London organised by Stop the War. He was an official steward responsible for the route of the march and for safety.
He was with a group of people that I knew, one of whom was a friend that I worked with. He came across as being very straightforward, very down to earth, very interested in other people, quite generous, but not the life and soul of the party. He kind of stepped back a little bit from the crowd.
At the time, Andrea was living in a rented flat in Maida Vale, central London. She thought she found her life partner.
We were pretty much together from the day we met, and we were pretty much inseparable. So he moved in with me within a few weeks of meeting.
Did he ever tell you he loved you?
Yeah, he did frequently. He was quite expressive. He was very affectionate, very warm. And I think he gave that impression to everyone. People were drawn to him because he was kind and gentle and caring, and I felt very loved. It felt very genuine.
Because it was so serious, Andrea introduced him to her family in Scotland. When she attended her sister's graduation, he was invited. When she went on a family holiday to Whitby in Yorkshire, so did he. For the family, he was the devoted future son-in-law.
It was quite easy, really. He seemed to gel with them quite well. And he seemed to become very fond of them very quickly. He kind of made an effort to be in contact with them a lot.
Back in London, Carlo Neri was attending activist events with Andrea, including one above this anarchist bookshop in Whitechapel. Because Andrea was known to the group, Carlo Neri was trusted. He became a regular at this kind of event. And Carlo Neri was at the forefront of political rallies, working with anti-fascists and the Socialist Party.
Quite often he would be one of the people who was stewarding. He'd often have to be there really early and be there right till the end, because when you take that responsibility, you've got quite a different role. And he was very much involved in that aspect of it.
Carlo was clearly accepted by the group. His job as a locksmith could have been extremely useful for an undercover cop.
He quite often said people could improve the security of where they lived. And again, that seemed at the time to be hugely helpful. With hindsight, there's a different perspective, really, because there's a huge amount of people's locks that someone had access to.
So Carlo Neri had the keys to activists' flats. We discovered that he was living a double life. Not only was he secretly reporting back to Scotland Yard, what we don't know, but he had a wife and a son living less than 10 miles away. Carlo used the actual names of his real family in his cover story, presumably to guard against slip-ups, a classic undercover technique.
He brought photos of the kind of key people in his family into our house, and they were in our flat. So I had pictures of his son, his sister, and they were actually his real family members that I know now. Obviously at the time I didn't know any of this, but now I know they were real people in his real life. And there were always reasons why I didn't meet them.
We know that his wife knew he was a police officer. His occupation is written on the birth certificate of his son. We don't know how much, if anything, she knew about his undercover relationship with Andrea. Carlo had to invent stories to maintain both lives. How could he justify time away from the Maida Vale flat and his live-in relationship with Andrea to spend time with his real family? First, he told Andrea that a new job meant he would have to travel for work.
Because of his interest in food, because of his interest in Italian food, he then got a job working for a company which did import and export of sort of fine quality foods and wines and things. So he then started to do some travelling with that job.
Very convenient for Carlo, because his sister did in fact run an Italian deli, so he could bring home fine foods and wines. The cover story would work. He also found an excuse to be away every other weekend.
He was probably away from home for 4 or 5 nights every fortnight, and that would be due to work trips, and every other weekend he would go to Cornwall to see his child. Because as far as I was concerned, I was going to spend my life with this man, and his life was my life, and having that strong relationship with a child is a really important thing.
There were no access visits to Cornwall, of course. His son was just down the road in the family home. In terms of his relationship with Andrea, it was going from strength to strength. Just 3 months after they met, he proposed to her at home in the flat he shared in Maida Vale.
It was New Year. We had a party with a few friends. It was, a really, really nice gathering, not a huge party, probably about 12 of us. And he asked me to marry him. Then I said yes. We rang my mum. We told my mum.
Carlo and Andrea spent the next year together, but by Christmas 2003, the Met and Carlo decided it was time to bail out. He then began the most cynical of exit strategies, saying his father was on his deathbed in Italy and he had to be there.
He said he was really distressed, and he'd been missing for a week. He'd been out of contact for a week at that point.
But a dying father was not dramatic enough, it seems, for his exit strategy. While in Italy, Carlo said he'd learned something truly terrible about a female relative.
He told me that she had been sexually abused by their father. I mean, the stuff that he was disclosing was horrendous. It was quite awful, And I think if you love someone and you're with someone, you have massive amounts of compassion for them. You do for anyone who's experiencing that difficulty. But when you live with them and when you love them and you see them being in that much pain, or so you think, you want to support them.
Andrea tried to save the relationship, but Carlo seemed to be having a breakdown. He moved out 4 months later, taking everything down to the last fridge magnet with him. He went to live with other activists in the group. Their relationship survived for a while, But in November 2004, 2 years after they first met, he sent her an email saying he was breaking all contact. And after that, he simply disappeared.
Newsnight, now on BBC Two with Kirsty Walk.
Tonight, the environmental protesters, the undercover cop, and his betrayal in his own...
That was that until activists and journalists, Newsnight included, started investigating how the Met infiltrated protest groups.
People who were being paid by the police.
Campaigners Peter Salmon and Evelyn Lubbers devised a survey list of 15 questions following this early work to try to identify undercover cops in other groups. For example, did they have cars and vans? Access to cash? Did they disappear without trace? Carlo Neri ticked all the boxes.
Someone must have signed it off. Someone must have planned it, maybe, and that's what we want to know. That is what this is all about. It's not about. Of course, it's also about the individual undercover officers and the damage they did. But someone thought this all out. Someone knew this.
The Met Police are now under intense pressure over the deployment of undercover officers. In November, 8 women who unwittingly entered into intimate sexual relationships with undercover police called this press conference.
The worst part of this is to recall that actually when he was with me, he was at work and being paid, and it's heartbreaking.
The Met have settled 7 of their legal claims for damages. Assistant Commissioner Martin Hewitt issued an abject apology.
It has become apparent that some officers, acting undercover while seeking to infiltrate protest groups, entered into long-term intimate sexual relationships with women, which were abusive, deceitful, manipulative and wrong. I acknowledge that these relationships were a violation of the women's human rights, an abuse of police power and caused significant trauma. I unreservedly apologise on behalf of the Metropolitan Police Service.
But if the Met thinks they've drawn a line under this affair, campaigners say they're very wrong. In this new case, Andrea says it's like being the victim of a state-sponsored crime.
This kind of level of emotional abuse, I would say, or psychological abuse was used to keep the relationship on the trajectory that they wanted it to be on. It's psychological torture and it's very damaging.
Andrea is now working with the solicitor who's represented all the other 8 women who've taken legal action against the police so far.
This is clearly a pattern that they worked on. The other women who had relationships all described similar exit strategies, and in each of those cases they were very harmful. This is one of the worst I've heard in terms of inventing a whole story of sexual abuse and domestic violence that didn't actually exist, and I think that was a particularly sick thing to do.
The Met refused to confirm or deny whether Carlo Neri was or is an undercover cop. It's their standard response. We know his true name and quite a few details about his life, including the fact that he infiltrated a number of demonstrations here in central London. He has a highly distinctive surname, and we decided not to broadcast this to protect his family. The Metropolitan Police issued a statement to Newsnight. Assistant Commissioner Martin Hewitt told us it no longer carries out long-term infiltration deployments into protest groups, but would accept responsibility for past failings, especially because there was a risk of collateral intrusion. The Met admitted there were failures of supervision and management in the past, but all deployments are now rigorously assessed for necessity and proportionality and governed by a strict legal framework that is subject to independent oversight. Andrea has just been given core participant status in the public inquiry into undercover policing now underway. She's only just begun to process the fact that 2 years of her life were effectively stolen by the state after our investigation uncovered the truth. A decade on and she's rebuilt her life. She has a partner and children, but the scars run deep.